Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us, and to the Hearts, we are so grateful again, really, from Goldfarb and from Colby. Thank you. I would like to take a moment to introduce our distinguished guest here tonight, Senator Leahy. It is such an honor to welcome you here, as the President said. 48 years in the Senate, an incredible career. He has chaired several key committees. I think I probably am missing some at this point, but Appropriations, Judiciary, Agriculture. And his leadership has shaped so many key laws in this country. And I will say, on top of all this, maybe not everyone knows, but he's also an enormous Batman fan, which may come up or may not. Since retiring from the Senate in 2023, Senator Leahy serves as the President's Distinguished Fellow at the University of Vermont. We are also so pleased to welcome his wife, Marcelle, so thank you so much for joining as well. We know how important you are to all of this. I'm also very pleased to introduce our moderators for this evening. We have Professor Joe Reisart, who is the chair of the Government Department, and we have Deb Purohit, who is a graduating senior, and a co-chair of the mock trial team. And we are very pleased that they will be moderating tonight's discussion. As those of you who have been with us on many Wednesdays, you'll know that we do a question and answer with our moderators. So they will ask questions of the senator for the first part of our evening, and then we'll open up to audience questions. And for community members, this is a special night because usually it's only students are able to ask questions. But for a special treat, because the senator is here, we are opening it up to everyone. And so we probably won't be able to get to all of the questions, but our goal here at Goldfarb and Colby is to have interactive communication. And so we're so happy that you can be here. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Reisart. And thank you. Let's get it going.
Well, thank you very much. Well, Senator, it's such a treat to have you here. And as my first question, I guess I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself a little more to the audience by inviting you to reflect on a couple of your proudest accomplishments from your time in the Senate.
Well, I can certainly reflect on one right at the top, and I think of Peter Hart in this regard. When I first ran for the Senate, Vermont was, I think, the only state in the Union that never elected a Democrat. We also, since the popular election of senators, had not elected anybody under 50. And I had said I was going to run against a senator. Initially, I thought it'd be my opponent, who had served throughout my whole lifetime, from the time I was born on through. And everybody said, "That's okay, kid. Have fun. What are you going to do after you lose?" Peter Hart came and told me, "You can win." Even though Vermont's never elected a Democrat, never elected anybody under 50, you can do it. And he worked with Marcel and myself, and a wonderful man no longer living, and we put together. So that was an accomplishment because, as it turned out, at that time, the Vietnam War was actually popular in Vermont. The majority opinion was for it. Our state's largest newspaper strongly supported it. And they put me on Armed Services Committee in, I remember it was 1975, waiting for an opening in appropriations where I really wanted to go. And they had to vote to reauthorize the war, which they always did automatically. I was the junior-most, newest member, and the first vote to reauthorize it lost by one vote. The looks I was getting, including calls from President Ford, Henry Kissinger, and others. And they had another vote, another vote, another vote. And the editor of our largest newspaper had made sure I knew that I would never be reelected if I voted to end the war. And finally, the last vote, they turned to one of the most conservative members of the Senate, Harry Flood Byrd, an independent. He voted no. And I'll never forget the chair saying, Mr. Byrd, did you intend to vote no? He said, yes, they've lied to me long enough. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in the room. He turned to his staff member, best get the president on the phone, the war is over. Now, even though I was told to make me a one-term senator, I did stay a while longer after that, and got a chance to do a number of things. The Leahy War Victims Fund for victims, landmines, and others around the world, but especially in Vietnam, where we're still clearing. Started that with the back end George H.W. Bush before we had full recognition with Vietnam, and they were at the University of Vermont having a symposium of that last week. But doing other things, organic farm bill, and the update of our criminal code, and all this. It's just there was one chance after another. Being in the Senate, being one of 100, and you could do it. And it was a different kind of Senate back then, where Republicans and Democrats could work together. Probably my thing that makes me the happiest, that I was able to pass more bipartisan legislation than anybody else in the Senate for decades. So without going on too long, I'll stop at that point. There are so many things that a kid from Montpelier, Vermont, had a chance to do, and I'm appreciative of that. And I'd like to see the Senate and the House come back to where they had been and where they should be.
So I know we had a plan to let you have the next question, but I feel like this is the moment to follow up with a question I intended to ask later, and that would be, you've just alluded to the changes that you've seen in the United States Senate, a decline in bipartisanship, a rise in animosity. I've read interviews where you've said similar things. Would you, in your view, what are the causes of that? And what, if anything, might be done to bring back the bipartisanship?
Too many people come in there with no sense of history, no sense of wanting to do anything except glorify themselves. I don't mean to get angry here, but it just does get me angry. They could care less about keeping their words. They care far more about getting 10 seconds on the news. Let me tell you a story of how that is different. The early 1980s, we were locked on the floor in a debate, and Howard Baker was the majority leader, Republican, one of the best majority leaders the Senate ever had. And he's going to keep everybody in until midnight, until try to break this. A group of us went down to his office. Ted Stevens of Alaska, Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, myself, and a couple others, Republicans and Democrats. We said, look, tempers are failing. Recess the Senate in the morning. We come from this from different points of view. We've worked out a compromise on this, and it will pass. We'll each bring enough votes to pass. He turned to each one of us, do you agree with that? We said, yes, nothing in writing. He knew that none of us would ever break our word. So he recessed. 2 hours after we recessed, a bomb went off in the Capitol. People forget this. The next morning we came in, the smell of smoke, shattered statues, some of these statues going back 100 years, painting shredded. The cloakrooms of both the Republicans and Democrats had these magnificent stained glass windows. They were blown in, and the pieces of glass were on the other side of the room. Every staff member, every senator would be sitting there waiting for the next vote would have either died or been seriously injured. But we'd recessed because people would keep their word. But that was history. We've got to go back to that. I don't mean to be lecturing you.
No. We asked.
Senator Leahy, I actually want to talk about one of those changes. You mentioned in a PBS NewsHour interview that you were concerned that the Supreme Court was becoming politicized. And I know as your background as being a lawyer, you mentioned that one of the causes of that you think was Donald Trump's rhetoric. As we look towards a possible second Trump term, what are you thinking is the standing of the Supreme Court, and how do we get Americans to believe in the Supreme Court again?
Second Trump term, my wife's first generation Franco-American. She's born in Vermont, but she's entitled to Canadian citizenship. That happens, Marcel. I think we're heading back to Canada. No, it's distressing to see the change in the U.S. Supreme Court. When I was a prosecutor, I argued probably more cases than anybody else in the state, in our Vermont Supreme Court. They're all Republican judges at that time. I never thought of it ever being partisan. I knew they would look at the case and decide, well, just like you do in your mock trials, whether you're plaintiff or defendant, they're going to judge you on what you have. This is what we did. And everybody respected the decisions. Just read the polls. Look at the respect of the Senate, of the Supreme Court coming down, down, down. And it's becoming more and more political. That doesn't help the country. It really doesn't. And I voted for both Republican and Democratic Supreme Court justice. In fact, if you have another minute, I'll tell you the story on that. John Roberts, when he was up for Chief Justice, there was the Democratic leader of the Senate gave a strong speech why he should not be on the court. I was the second person to speak. I spoke and said I was going to vote for him, even though we disagreed in different subjects. I thought, good man, honest man, but I also didn't want a Supreme Court to have a Chief Justice who was voted along party lines. A couple of people criticized that. A new senator came on the floor and said, he hadn't told me he was going to do this, said he was going to vote against John Roberts, but he did not want anybody to question my motives because they knew I did it out of integrity. And I went to that new senator and I said, Barack Obama, I appreciate this.
That's really interesting. I think one of the other changes, especially you've served with, I think you mentioned in that interview, with 20% of the senators that this country has ever had, which is just as surprising to me.
I started in 1812.
Yeah. Just as surprising to me as it was when I just said that number to everyone here. But I wanted to ask about one of the oldest things that hasn't changed. Vice President Kamala Harris just called to end the filibuster to pass abortion rights legislation. What do you think is the role of the filibuster in 2024, and do we still need it in the Senate today?
Well, I go back and forth in my own mind because the filibuster has been modified considerably by the number of votes you want. It was working okay when it forced senators to sit down and try to find bipartisan solutions because you easily could do it. And we also required you couldn't just put in an objection and leave and go off to a fundraiser somewhere. You had to stay on the floor and actually debate. So there weren't many because people just wouldn't. The biggest change I'd like to see is, one, you can lower the number a bit, but you have to have people be able to stay on the floor and do it. Some people would love to have a majority of one, presidents have a majority of one, and be able to put through anything they wanted. President Trump is not president now, but he stopped a border bill, a bipartisan border bill, negotiated by some of the most conservative and most liberal senators. And it would have passed. It would have passed the House. And he told the House, you're not allowed to take it up. They said, oh, okay. Because he said, I want to use that for a campaign thing. Our border would be a lot better if it went. By the same token, if you have absolutely no curtailment, you could totally, a president in one term could totally revamp our courts, our military, our way of responding to natural disasters. Will respond if you're a state of my party or not if you're not. So, and I've talked with Vice President Harris about this, and I don't know. I'm not trying to duck the question. I don't know the right answer. I've wrestled with this. I know she has. But if you do it for abortion, do you do it to do away with what little gun laws we have? Do we do it for, you can go on down, back and forth. The Senate, when I came there, was not perfect, but we considered it the conscience of the nation. And it was slowly coming out of segregation. Lyndon Johnson really gave up his presidency to bring him back and get rid of segregation. And you saw Republicans and Democrats come together. I would much rather see us going back to doing bipartisan things. I'm not sure doing away with the filibuster accomplishes that. I'd lower the number. 60 is too many. I'd lower that probably to 55. And I'd require the people who are trying to stay on the floor and speak and have to answer.
All right. Well, thank you. I'd like to ask one question now related to your service on the Appropriations Committee, right? That most important committee, arguably, in the United States Senate. At the end of your career, you were chair of that committee. You were vice chair of that committee a few Congresses before that. It's hard not, from the outside, to look at the budget process and think something is broken. You know, so rarely in the last 50 years have we had, all the budget bills completed on time. We've been funding the government with continuing resolutions, with one crisis punctuating with another. How do we fix that?
You require votes. You have votes in the committee. I mean, I got a bill through basically on Christmas Eve, and I was leaving the Senate 8 days later. Funded it was the most complex, complete appropriations bill, funded every part of the government, and got an overwhelming bipartisan vote. Susan Collins, staff is here. She helped greatly on that, and she was one of the ones that voted for it, a key Republican. It's not going to work if you don't go back to that. I mean, now you have a wonderful person who's chair of the committee, Patty Murray, but she's been told the House won't take up the bills. And neither the House nor the Senate stays in very much. You've got to go back to actually voting on these things. If you don't vote on them, you're not going to get them done. And this last 2 years, there's not been anything of significance voted in the House or the Senate. I mean, I could go into hours of what, but it's frustrating. And somebody asked me if I missed the Senate, and I remember what a friend of mine told me to run into somebody who had retired, and he said, "You missed the place." He said, "Well, I missed the circus, not the clowns." And that was a Republican senator who told me that. And picked the time to tell me right at the height of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial, and I was presiding over it, sitting up there trying to be very serious. He came in and whispered that to me. That was a difficult time.
Senator, the Senate is something that's just so far away from us, at least here in Waterville or wherever we all come from. How do you explain what the Senate is to students and why, when they see things that aren't getting passed, like student loan forgiveness or, like I mentioned before, abortion rights,
Sure.
How do you explain what the Senate is supposed to do when it's causing so much frustration among young voters?
No, it's a very good question. I would tell them, you've got to get involved. You've got to, Senate terms are 6 years, but usually, well, not usually, every 2 years will be one senator up and then a time without one. But go and spend time with your senators. Go to their offices, ask them, work on campaigns, work on people you want to be there. But go to hearings if you can get to Washington and ask questions. And ask why is both the Senate and the House gone so much? Why aren't they there debating these issues? Because if all you can vote for is something that's going to be easily popular, you're not doing your job. I mean, of course I want help for students. After all, when I first came to the Senate, my mentor was the Republican senator from Vermont, Bob Stafford. You've all heard of Stafford loans. He brought together Democrats and Republicans to do that. It's a major piece of legislation. I think it's fair to ask every senator, whatever state you're from, what legislation are you most proud of? Which ones have you worked with members of the other party? And they have to answer that. The Senate is, I think posters like Peter Hart know I would have been reelected easily if I'd run again. But Marcel and I were homesick. We wanted to get back to Vermont. And I was getting frustrated with the way the Senate was in both parties. I'm trying to be as honest as I can to answer this.
Well, that's great. Let me ask then about an accomplishment you didn't actually mention when I asked my first question. Maybe it was modesty, but about the Leahy Law, right, which, of course, prohibits the United States from supporting military forces that have been, shown to be engaged in gross human rights violations. And so I guess I'd like to ask you, what, first of all, prompted you to pursue that, to want that to be enacted into law, and then how'd you go about it, and do you think it's been a success?
It's been a success in some places. I went about it because, especially on appropriations, I started going to a number of war zones and countries we were trying to help out. We used the Leahy War Victims Fund with the Leahy Law to eliminate landmines. But I also saw where we had places, we saw in Central America, we saw in some places in Africa where we were funding and supporting military units. They were going out and committing just arbitrary executions, grab people, shoot them, all kinds of violations of human rights. So we put in this legislation that's run by the State Department that they can require foreign aid, American aid, to be withheld from any foreign military unit that's violating human rights. That has worked well with most countries. There has been, I wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post, basically saying, why isn't that being looked at more closely in Israel right now? I have no sympathy for Hamas, committed one of the worst violation of human rights I've ever seen in my life. The reaction, though, in some ways has strengthened Hamas. And the reaction is going on too much. In the last 48 hours, some of our arms and others are being withheld from the Israelis until they allow the civilian population of Gaza to have health, get food, water, and so on. I mean, it's never going to be rebuilt the way it should have been. And you see Lebanon, the war side there, Iran, not quite sure what it's going to do, but perfectly willing to use Hezbollah and Hamas and everything else and fund them to go after Israel. But Israel's leadership is going to start looking at a longer picture. You know, right up until the time of that terrible attack against innocent people at a music festival by Hamas, Israel had arranged once a month for another country to send bribes to Hamas through Israel. And that really worked out well. So I don't want to get too much into history, but I look at Israel and Jordan fought each other and locked in trying to get their way out. Ishaq Rabin was the prime minister of Israel, King Hussein, the king of Jordan. And they finally reached an agreement, a peace agreement, which still stands. And I had breakfast with each one of them separately and asked them, how did that come about? They told me the same story, and I'll try to make it as brief as I can. Hussein called Rabin and said, look, our people are, negotiators are stuck. You and I can work this out. You and I meet. Rabin assumed he meant Geneva or something like that. I said, sure, where? He said, I'll come to Israel. Now, there's a price on Hussein's head in Israel. If you've been there, you know there's an Allenby Bridge. One side is in Jordan, the other side in Israel. So Rabin's waiting on one side of the Allenby Bridge. A whole number of cars pull up on the other side. All these armed guards get out. The king gets out. He waves them away. He walks alone across the Allenby Bridge. Prime Minister Rabin tells his security people and his driver, out, give me the keys, holds the door for the king. He gets in. I'm sure that car's full. But drove to his office, just the two of them. And they worked it out and agreed on something that brought about the final settlement. And when they were done, remember there's a price of Rabin's head in Jordan. He tells the king, I'll walk you home. And the two of them walk alone, get to the end, stand, and salute each other. I asked them both, did you feel for your safety? He said, no, he's a soldier. He gave me his word I'd be safe. They said almost exactly the same words, two different conversations. I worry about the Middle East because I see it becoming so unraveled. I wonder if they'll ever go back together. I remember being there at the signing of the peace agreement. Out in the desert, 100 degrees, God, it was hot. And the group was sitting there. King Hussein got up to speak, and all of a sudden, these 4 or 5 people in the back stand up and start shouting something in Arabic. You could see the Secret Service going like this, standing next to our president. Somebody started, and they relaxed. And I turned to the Arab speaker and I said, well, what do they say? They said, oh, long live the king, long live the king. I said, okay, I'll accept that. But it's...
I'm sorry, Senator.
That's too long an answer.
Not at all, it's not too long. I wanted to say, we're gonna turn to audience Q&A. I have heard from the tech geniuses that there is a little interference on the microphones that might have to do with having cell phones in the pocket. So if any of you gentlemen have cell phones, apparently they do more than just use for phones. And if that doesn't work, we can always swap out a mic. But for now, if you could just put your cell phones maybe someplace, yes? That would be terrific. And
Mine's off.
Thank you so much, Senator. And I think, Professor Reiser, I think we're ready to, do you have more than one cell phone? This is exciting. But, and if you want to start with student questions, that would be terrific.
All right, thank you. No, I had turned off my mic. I thought it was just me. So I'd like to ask the students if we have volunteers. I think we have a first volunteer planted, so can I ask you to stand up and address your question to the senator? Maybe if you come more into his line of sight.
Okay. Hi, I'm Peggy, and thank you for being here today. My question is, how do you believe Trump's second impeachment trial has shaped the public's perception of accountability and justice?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first out.
I said, sorry. How do you believe Trump's second impeachment trial has shaped the public's perception of accountability and justice in the American political system? Thank you.
Well, he had two impeachment trials. Chief Justice Roberts presided over the first one, and I was President pro tem, and for the first time ever, Senator presided over one. I presided the second one. There were a number of senators who told me they felt he was guilty, but politically couldn't vote that way. Others, including a number of Republicans, who said, I'm going to vote guilty, because he is. An impeachment trial should be really something of the last result. Been voted for that, and I became the presiding officer over it. I felt that he was guilty. Remember, I've been a prosecutor for 8 years. But I look more at the dozens of felony convictions he has in New York right now. Those, I've followed the trials pretty closely. Those should be something Mr. Trump should worry about, because they're state courts. They can't be pardoned by a president. And I don't know if that answers your question, which is a good one, but I've never been there with a president, Republican or Democrat, who had been convicted of numerous felonies, who had been one who had faced an impeachment trial, President Clinton, and but as a former prosecutor, state prosecutor, look at the state court things. I never thought I'd see anybody, either party, who's running for president, has been president, wants to be president, would ever face charges like that. And remember, you have to have a unanimous jury verdict.
All right, another student question? I guess we have another one over here. Maybe be visible.
Hi, my name's Wilson. I'm from Oklahoma. It seems like a topic of the night has been the lack of good faith between Republicans and Democrats in the 21st century, or at least the Senate in the last few years. My question is along the lines of the filibuster, which was already discussed, but more specifically, the removal of the filibuster in the appellate courts when you were the chair of the Judiciary Committee. Do you regret that now that Mitch McConnell weaponized it for the Supreme Court? And are you worried about requisite tit for tat from the Democrats in the form of court packing? And how do we get out of this negative feedback loop? Thank you.
Thank you. Superb questions. I could go on for hours and I won't. Let's just take the Supreme Court. I'm not in favor of court packing. I am in favor of having the ethics rules apply to the Supreme Court justices in the same way they do to a federal district judge or a federal appellate judge. And they should apply there. I was disturbed that Senator Graham, as chair of Judiciary the last couple of years of Donald Trump's term, did a number of things he had said publicly he would never do, would never stand for, and that is to rush things through when there's no quorum, rush things through on without time to debate. Even it's just come out now, that even the FBI background, which is always done on every court, significant court nominee, on one of them, with allegations that came through of criminal misconduct, the FBI was told they could only have a few days and they could not look into certain questions. That disturbs me greatly. I mean, I voted for Republican judges, I voted for Democratic judges. But if something's being hidden, if the rules are not being followed, first question I ask is why? You know, I spent 8 years as a prosecutor. Somebody isn't doing what they say they're doing, so the antenna pop up.
Right.
And I think that's been wrong. Yeah. I think it's hurt the country. And I've talked with a number of my friends in the judiciary on that. In fact, I'm accepted an invitation. The state Supreme Court justices are meeting in Vermont in a couple of weeks. And our Chief Justice asked me if I'd come by and speak at lunch, and I'm going to tell them they're setting the model. You know, I argued an awful lot of cases before our Vermont Supreme Court. I was probably the only Democrat in the room. I never questioned what they would rule the right way, nor did anybody else. And if we don't have a court, if we don't have appellate courts and Supreme Courts, that the American public can look at and say, well, they're stepping away from, they're not getting involved in politics. We're going to hurt. We're going to hurt. And people are going to stop, they're going to say, why should I listen to this law? They don't, why should I?
Yeah.
Senator, I actually wanted to follow up on what Wilson said about...
You should know this. Young man is in mock trial competition, and just in a very tough one, where he did extremely well. And just tell the audience, how much notice are you given whether you're going to be plaintiff or defendant?
Well, we get 10 minutes. So.
I'm glad I had more than that when I was a prosecutor. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to follow up on what Wilson said about how it feels like there's less good faith between Democrats and Republicans. And you brought up how people would give you their word and how that would mean something. Do you think that doesn't mean anything anymore?
Well, I don't think anybody bothers to give their word. I think they're far more interested in TV interview or... Here's something I did, especially as I became more senior and then when I was president pro tem. I had some lovely offices in the Capitol. One I liked the most had a balcony on it overlooking the mall. And, you know, we had a lot of evening sessions. And so you could see the sunset, and you could be on the floor in a minute, literally a minute if you wanted to. And I invite senators of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, to come down, enjoy the sunset, and just sit there and let's talk. And there's no press, no staff, nothing else. You'd be amazed when they're actually given a quiet moment like that, how many of them would come together and say, you know, if you go a little bit on this, and we went a little bit on this, and we worked out so much legislation. They call it the Leahy Prayer Hour.
More questions over here? Yes, in the front row.
Hi, my name is Kat McManus. I'm a sophomore and a history major. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. We all really appreciate it. And I was wondering, I think one of the pillars of the American government system is the separation of church and state. Given your personal religious experiences and your experiences in the Senate, where do you believe that balance lays? And also, do you believe that current religious ideologies and agendas are clouding the American government system? Thank you.
No, it's an excellent question, and one I worry about. There should be a separation of church and state. I'm proud of my own religion, but I respect others. And nothing frustrates me more than whether state governments or some in federal government want to pass legislation enshrining one religion. It's wrong. It's wrong. I think back to my grandfather was a stone carver in Barrie, Vermont, died when my father was only 13. My father was born there. Father had to go to work, and the signs at that time said no Irish need apply, or if you couldn't quite figure that out, it said no Catholic need apply. And my father started his own printing business. He never asked anybody their religion. And it became a very successful printing business. Now those are the stories you hear as a child, and you think this will never come back. But we're hearing too much of this. I know of some South-style religious leaders who make millions of dollars getting involved in politics. They shouldn't. There are enough people in this country, of all faiths or no faith, who are suffering, who could use the kind of help religious leaders could give. That's what they should be doing. They should not be involved in politics. And the House and Senate should not be encouraging them to be. Keep politics out of religion. Keep politics out of religion. If you practice a religion, practice it, respect it, grow from it, but keep politics out of it.
I feel like I should say amen. More questions? Oh, we have in the front row here. A microphone is coming.
Hi, my name is Daksh. I'm a junior here at Colby. Thank you so much for being here once again. We've talked so much today about bipartisan bills and seeing how we don't see them as often anymore. We all know that you have been seen as, for a long time, a pragmatic legislator, always willing to compromise and find that middle ground. I guess I'm kind of stuck thinking, can you speak a little bit to the ethical considerations that come into play when deciding which values or provisions are negotiable and which are not? And then furthermore, is there a point where, I guess, compromise becomes complicity?
No, it's a good question, but one thing I won't compromise, my ethics or my moral code. And I refuse to join on some legislation because I'd have to. I also find areas where we can bring people together. I'll tell you one is, and I referred to it a while ago, a Vietnamese came and did a conference here, or in Vermont rather, a couple of weeks ago, talking about what I had done at the end of the Vietnam War, other than casting the deciding vote, as it turned out, and the war would have ended eventually anyway. But I sought bipartisan help to help the victims of landmines and to clean up landmines in Vietnam. That's the first step. Our State Department said Vietnam hadn't done enough, hadn't come forward with enough, so we couldn't do it yet. I went down and saw President George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, a Republican. I'd known him for years, when he was CIA director and when he'd been vice president. Remember, he and the then Secretary of State, Jim Baker, and I told them what I wanted to do to bring this over. They thought it was a good idea. I said, well, you got Assistant Secretary so-and-so thinks it's a bad idea. Bush says, Baker, get him on the phone. He gets him on the speakerphone. The poor guy doesn't realize Bush and I are sitting there. And he starts to say, Leahy's down here all the time. He's pushing. But it's too early to give any aid to Vietnam. They got to do more for us. So we think it's a bad idea. Baker said, okay, I got somebody here who thinks it's a good idea, Mr. President. So we went over. I brought a bipartisan delegate. Every time I'd lead a trip abroad, I'd bring both Republicans and Democrats to work together. We had, I'll never forget, we were giving these people wheelchairs. They've been either crawling on the ground or hopping on stools for years and years. Their legs blown off by American landmines. And throughout this, one was just staring at me. And I thought, God, this man must hate me. They said, would you pick him up and put him in his wheelchair? I did. My wife, being a medical surgical nurse, told me how to pick him up. I didn't want to break a bone. He was so fragile. I picked him up, put him in his wheelchair, started to get up. He grabbed my shirt. He pulled me down. And he kissed me. Now, you never forget something like that. And every time I've gone to Vietnam since, either that man has been there or they've had a picture of him. And what it says, we'll work together. We have many MIAs, they're missing in action. Predominantly Vietnamese, but Americans. We're working together to do that. We're working together to get rid of Agent Orange. We're working together to help the next couple generations that are suffering from the effects of Agent Orange. And we are a better country in doing it, and Vietnam's a better country in doing it. Those are the things we should be doing. We should be saying, instead of this, I was going to say bullshit, but you don't use language like that. This baloney, we're the great country and we do no wrong. Of course we can do wrong. We have. We have in some wars. And that's why the Leahy Law, and that's why the others, my way of trying to make it better. But others worked with me on that, Republicans and Democrats. We've got to come back to that.
All right, more questions from the audience? What do we have? I saw this hand first in the back. Oh.
Thank you, Senator, for coming in. I'm Gavin Stern, and I'm a senior. You started tonight with talking about the votes that you were proudest of making. Are there any votes in the Senate that you regret making?
I voted more than all but one or two people in the history of the country. And I can go back there and see something. What the hell was I thinking? And fortunately, almost all those are issues that come up again. And you get a chance to go on it. I don't expect to be perfect. I do I do try to make it clear if I think I voted wrong. I know when George H.W. Bush said, I'm not I've been there with a lot of presidents. I don't mean to single out just this one. But he'd been the chair of the Republican Party, and then they named him head of the CIA, and he'd have to be confirmed by the Senate for that. I said I didn't think anybody being head of a political party should be head of the CIA. And I voted no. I told him I was going to. Afterward, he handled the CIA so, I was going to say impartially, so professionally. I went to see him after. I said, look, that vote was a mistake. I think you've done a good job. And I think he appreciated that.
All right, I think I have time for one more question from the audience. And, well, Peter Hart.
Oh,
Peter Hart has a question. I think.
I'm going to stand.
I think he gets.
I want to ask you a serious, very difficult question, and it is that if you were going to get stuck on an island with 3 other senators, which 3 senators would you choose?
Well, a lot of the senators have been stuck in one of these big White House airplanes on long overseas trips, and most of them okay. I think one is no longer alive, Bob Stafford, Republican. He was Mr. Republican in our state. And when I got elected as the first Democrat, he took me under his wing. His wife offered to babysit our children while we looked for a place to live. Marcel's comment was, you don't know what hell raises our kids are? He'd be one. I hate to name those who live living because then others would say, why? A person, well, that's a tough question. Maybe it is easy. Oh, God. Yes. No, well, Marcel was saying Hubert Humphrey. Hubert Humphrey, I'd only been there a few weeks. And he comes up to me and says, Patrick, you ever been to Moscow? I said, well, Moscow, Vermont, which is 600 people. No, he said, I got to go to Moscow. I got to see Brezhnev. I want you and Marcel to come. We just finished that, and as you know, we were flat broke. You were there at the end of that campaign because nobody thought I could win, so no money was coming in. So I blurted out, what's the airfare? He said, no, we're going to take Jerry's plane. I said, Jerry who? He said, Jerry Ford, he's the president. Don't you read the paper? And I found out how nice those trips could be. So I'm going to leave it with those two because I could probably, there are several that I'd like because I'm just thinking of some of our meetings, and I probably shouldn't say this, but these late night meetings when we're trying to work things out were called the Leahy Prayer Hour in Holy Water. And one senator said, well, holy water, I'm Jewish. He said, well, he's got 12-year-old holy water. He's got single malt holy water. So that's kosher. But then somebody like Mitt Romney would come in, a devout Mormon. He'd have club soda, Jeff Flake, another one. And these are all people I'd be happy to spend time with because they're people with a sense of history. And that's what I love the most, especially those who've been for and had that sense of history. So that's a poor way of answering your question, Peter. It's only because Peter got people who really answer questions. I ever got elected in the first place. Because he told me where I had a possibility of winning and where don't waste your time because they're not going to vote for you because you're the only one on the ballot. So thank you.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to end. Thank you, Mr. Hart. Thank you, Senator Leahy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.